Hello and welcome back to my historical American Girl doll story time. um, Today we're going to pick up and read chapter 2 in Meet Kit. Last time we read chapter 1, and you might remember that Mrs. Kittredge, Kit's mom, had a garden club party out on their terrace. And I didn't explain what a terrace was last time, so I thought I'd start out today explaining that that's just like a patio outside. So they would have an outside area, and this would be the kind of furniture that they would have outside on a patio. This is official American Girl kit dining ware, and it's kind of metal, and so this would be the style that they would have had back then. And while she was having her garden party, they found out that some of their friends were having some difficulty, that the father had gone to Chicago to look for work, and the mom and son were no longer going to be able to stay in their home. So Kit's mom has offered for Mrs. Howard and her son Sterling to come stay with them. And Kit, at the end of our last book, was very excited because she thought a boy would give her lots of adventures for her newspaper column. So today we're going to pick up and see what happens next with Kit Kittredge. Chapter 2 is called Read All About It. Kit's real name was Margaret Mildred Kittredge. She was named after her mother and an aunt of her dad's. But when she was very little, her dad used to sing her a song that went like this. Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, boys, smile. It was a song he'd learned when he was a soldier fighting in the Great War. Kit loved it. She'd beg Dad, sing my song, sing the Kit song. Pretty soon, everyone began to call her Kit, which was also short for Kittredge, and the name stuck. Kit didn't like the name Margaret Mildred anyway. It didn't fit her. So they have a picture right here of what a kit bag would have been for soldiers. And it said it was from when her dad was a soldier in the Great War. Well, the Great War is what they called World War I during Kit's time. They didn't have World War II yet, and so there was no reason to call it World War I if they didn't know that there was going to be World War II. And it was called the Great War during that time because it was the biggest war that had ever happened. So great in the sense of big is why they called it the Great War. There were more countries involved, more people killed. It was just a really big worldwide event. Kit didn't like her name Margaret Mildred anyway. It didn't fit her. It was too flouncy. Kit was not a flouncy girl. Right now, she was feeling especially exasperated with flounces because the stool she was sitting on was covered with them. Ruthie and the garden club ladies had left, and Kit was finishing her newspaper for Dad. She had to sit with one leg bent under her to reach the typewriter because the new flouncy stool was as soft as a marshmallow and too low. Kit rolled her newspaper out of the typewriter and read it. She was very pleased with her headline, "The Howards Are Coming." That ought to get Dad's attention. Under the headline, Kit had written, Mrs. Howard is in Mother's Garden Club. Mrs. Howard and her son Sterling are going to be staying with the Kittredge family for a while. Mr. Howard is in Chicago. Having the Howards here will be fun because Sterling can play catch with Kit Kittredge, the best 9-year-old catcher in Cincinnati. Garden Club trouble. Phlox spots put Mrs. Wilmore beside herself. And so there's a close-up of her newspaper. Again, you can see she had to X out some things, and the typewriter dropped the D's. Kit was struggling with her drawing of two Mrs. Wilmores when she heard the car horn's cheery honk honk that signaled her favorite moment of the day. Dad was home from work. Kit snatched up her newspaper, flew downstairs, and burst out the door. "Extra, extra, read all about it," she shouted, waving her newspaper as Dad climbed out of his car. Dad caught Kit up in his arms. "How's my girl?" he asked. "Great," said Kit when her feet were back on the ground. "Look, I've got a newspaper for you today." "Oh ho," said Dad. His blue eyes were twinkly. So I want to stop for a minute and show you the picture close up. Remember that Kit's dad worked at a car dealership, and you can see in the picture he has a very old-time looking car. So at this point in time, in the 1930s, most families were, well, before the Depression, most families were able to afford a car for the first time. Cars had been invented in the early 1900s, but at first they were really, really expensive. And so not very many families had them, and only really upper-class rich families had them. However, in 1908, a man named Henry Ford developed something called the Model T. And so that car there that Kit's dad was driving looks a little bit like it might be a Model T car. That's what this one here is. And it was made much more inexpensively so that most middle-class families were able to afford them. Henry Ford was able to come up with an idea of what's called an assembly line. So in factories, instead of one person or a few people having to build the whole car, which meant they would have to know a lot of different things about the car, a lot of different skills, a lot of different parts, they developed something called the assembly line, where each person along the line had a different job. And so each person just had to know their one job or two jobs. So it meant that they could create cars quicker and for less money. And so that's how the Model T became the most sold car in the early 1900s. It was sold from 1908 to about 1927, and then some other cars came out. This one here is called the Ford Model Y, and I thought it kind of looked like in the picture too, at least the headlights there looked a little bit like that. So Kit's dad's car could have been either one of these, but this is what cars looked like at that time. And it was the first time that people, just average families, could have cars. He smiled a broad smile as he took Kit's newspaper and handed her the real one. He read Kit's headline in a booming voice, "The Howards are coming." Then he glanced at Kit and spoke in his normal voice. Are they coming for dinner?" "Nope," said Kit. "It's better than that. Read the whole story." Kit watched as Dad's eyes scanned the story. She noticed, much to her surprise, that his smile faded as he read. When Dad spoke, his voice sounded funny, as if he was trying too hard to be hearty. "Oh, well," he said, "this is big news." He gave Kit's hair a gentle tug. "I'm a lucky guy to have my own personal reporter to keep me on top of all the late-breaking stories," he said. "Come on, sweetheart, let's go get the details from your mother." Grown-ups are funny, Kit thought as she walked along next to Dad. They don't react the way you expect them to. Anyone would think that Dad was not pleased to have the Howards coming to stay. But why on earth wouldn't he be? Why do you think her dad might be a little bit concerned with people moving into their house at a time when there was not much money, at a time when things were tight? Hmm. 2 days later, Kit and Ruthie were sitting on the front steps waiting for Sterling and Mrs. Howard to arrive. The girls were reading while they waited. At least Ruthie was reading. Kit was too distracted. She was really just looking at the pictures in her book. Kit's copy of Robin Hood and His Adventures had belonged to Charlie when he was her age. It had wonderful illustrations, which Kit loved to study. She especially loved reading about the tree houses that Robin and his men lived in. The houses were connected by swinging bridges and catwalks made out of vines. Kit longed to sleep in a tree house high up near the sky, surrounded by leaves. She imagined that at night stars peeked through the leaves and the wind made the branches sway. Kit had spent many hours drawing plans for a tree house that she and Ruthie could build. Kit was not very good at sketching. Her drawings always looked like dog houses stuck up in trees. They didn't look anything like the tree houses in Sherwood Forest. "I bet," said Kit, "that Sterling can help us build a tree house." "Mm-hmm," said Ruthie with the tiniest hint of irritation at being interrupted when she was deep into the story of Beauty and the Beast. You probably recognize the story Beauty and the Beast. It's been around a really long time. The story Beauty and the Beast was actually first published in 1740. That's a really long time ago. Since Kit lives in 1934, 1740 was almost 200 years before when Kit lived. So that story's been around a really long time. It was not just made up by Disney. So Kit today is reading her Robin Hood book, once again, that we talked about in our last episode. It was hot, and the girls were licking chunks of ice that had been chipped off the big block of ice in the icebox. Kit had her catcher's mitt next to her, too. She wanted Sterling to see right away that she was interested in books, and baseball was not, she was interested in books and baseball, and was not the type of girl who only cared about things like dusting and baking and dresses. Kit's ice chunk had melted to a sliver when at last a cab pulled up to the end of the driveway. Kit and Ruthie stood up and waited politely on the front steps. The cab door opened and Mrs. Howard and a boy got out. When she saw Sterling, Kit felt as if someone had dropped her ice chip down her back. She was so surprised. Ruthie whistled softly. "I thought your mother said that Sterling was about our age," she whispered. "He looks like he's in kindergarten." Sterling stood next to the cab on two of the skinniest legs Kit had ever seen. He was short and pale and skinny all over. His head looked too big for his scrawny neck. The screen door opened, and Mother came out of the house. She stood between Kit and Ruthie and put her hands on their shoulders. "Mother," whispered Kit indignantly, "Sterling's a shrimp." "Now, Kit," said Mother, "Sterling is small for his age because his health is delicate, but I'm sure he's a very pleasant fellow." Gently, she pushed the girls forward. "Come along, ladies," she said. "Let's go greet our guests and make them feel welcome." Kit and Ruthie and Mother walked down the steps and toward the driveway. Mrs. Howard and the cab driver were unloading boxes and suitcases from the cab. Sterling just stood there. "Oh," said Mrs. Howard, all aflutter, "Margaret, you are such a dear to have us." She turned to Sterling. "Shake hands with Mrs. Kittredge, Lammy," she said, "and say hello to Kit and Ruthie." Sterling shook Mother's hand and nodded at the girls. He looked even worse close up. He had colorless hair, colorless eyes, and a red, runny nose. Kit towered over him, and Ruthie could have made two of him, he was so puny. All right, I'm going to do some adjusting here. Seems like "Oh dear," fussed Mrs. Howard. "All this excitement is not good for Sterling. The poor lamb. He'll have to lie down right away and rest." "Of course," said Mother. "Come with me and we'll get him settled." Kit and Ruthie stood on the driveway and watched as Mrs. Howard and Mother propelled Sterling into the house. The cab driver followed them, carrying an armload of suitcases and boxes. As soon as they were gone, Kit turned to Ruthie and imitated Sterling. She snuffled her nose and made her eyes wide and unblinking. Ruthie giggled, and then she said, "Of course, in fairy tales you always learn not to judge by appearances. Lots of times, perfectly nice people are under a spell. Think of Beauty and the Beast." But over the next few days, it was clear to Kit that Ruthie's Beauty and the Beast theory didn't work in real life. At least not in Sterling's case. He never said a word. But then he didn't have to. His mother did all the talking. And most of her sentences began with the words, "Sterling can't." When Kit and Ruthie invited Sterling to run through the sprinkler with them, Mrs. Howard said, "Sterling can't be in the sun because his skin is so fair. And Sterling can't run because he has weak lungs. Sterling can't get wet because he might catch a chill. And Sterling can't play in the yard because he's allergic to bee stings." Kit abandoned any idea of Sterling helping with a treehouse or playing catch. Pretty soon, Kit and Ruthie gave up on inviting Sterling to do anything, because the answer was always, "Oh, Sterling can't." At first, Kit thought Mrs. Howard was making the whole thing up about how fragile Sterling was. It wasn't as if he had a sickness like rickets or scurvy or any of the really interesting diseases that Kit knew about from reading pirate stories. Sterling didn't even have any spots or rashes. However, after he'd been there a week, Sterling got truly sick. Though it was only a cold, he did have a fever and a terrible cough. Mrs. Howard said that he had to stay in bed and have all his meals brought to him on a tray. Kit could hear Sterling coughing and sniffling and blowing his nose all day long. Everyone had to tiptoe past the door to his room so they wouldn't disturb Sterling in case he was napping. Kit held her nose when she passed by, because outside his room smelled strongly of Vicks VapoRub, even though the door was always shut. Vicks VapoRub is still around today. It has a very strong minty menthol smell to it. People don't use it quite as much as they once did. But one afternoon, Kit noticed that the door to the guest room was open. She sneaked a peek inside. Sterling was propped up on the pillows, and Mrs. Howard was nowhere to be seen. Of course, it was hard to see anything in the room. It was dark because the shades were pulled down. Kit stood in the doorway and looked at Sterling's moon-white face on the pillow. "Gosh, it sure is stuffy in here," Kit said to Sterling. "Don't you want me to open the window or something?" Sterling nodded. Kit opened the window a crack so that a breath of air and a thin line of sunlight came through. "That's better," she said. Kit turned to go. She was halfway to the door when she saw a photograph next to Sterling's bed that stopped her in her tracks. "Hey," she said, "is that Ernie Lombardi, the catcher for the Reds?" See the little picture right there? Sterling's round eyes were as unblinking as an owl's as he looked at Kit. His nose was stuffed up, so his voice sounded weirdly low and husky. "Schnoz," he croaked. For a second, Kit didn't understand. Then she laughed and nodded. "Schnoz," she said. "That's Ernie Lombardi's nickname because he has such a big nose." In answer, Sterling blew his nose, which made a nice honking sound. Kit laughed again. "Ernie Lombardi is my favorite player on the Cincinnati Reds," she said. "He's the reason I'm a catcher. Well, and because my dad was a star catcher on his college team. Did you know that Ernie's the biggest guy on the Reds?" 6'3", whispered Sterling hoarsely. 230 pounds. "Right," said Kit, delighted. She rattled on. "It's funny that you like him," she said, "because he's so big and you're so little." "That's why," said Sterling simply. He didn't sound the least bit offended, even though right after she spoke, Kit realized that she'd said something she shouldn't have. "You know what?" said Kit, suddenly inspired. "I have a newspaper article about Ernie Lombardi." It was a photograph of him holding 7 baseballs in one hand at the same time. It used to be tacked up on my wall. My mother wouldn't let me put it back up after my room was painted pink. But I'll bet I can find it. Want to see it? Sterling nodded vigorously, and Kit noticed that his eyes weren't colorless at all. They were gray. "Okay," she said. "I'll get the article and you can read all about it." Kit tore back to her room and rummaged through the drawers of her desk. Where was that newspaper article with the photo of Schnoz? She hoped Mother hadn't thrown it away. Scrambling wildly through the bottom drawer, Kit found the scrap of newspaper at last. She raced back to Sterling's room, shouting, "I found it!" Kit flung open the door and bam! The door hit Mrs. Howard, who was standing right inside with a silver tray in her hands. "My land!" shrieked Mrs. Howard. She lurched forward, and the tray, which had one of Mother's best china teacups and saucers on it, went flying. The hot tea sloshed out all over the rug. The cup hit the floor and shattered, and the tray clanged to the ground with a noise like cymbals. And there's the picture. Oh dear, fussed Mrs. Howard at the same time Sterling started to cough loudly. Kit tried to apologize in a voice louder than his coughs, and Charlie appeared and added to the commotion by asking, "What happened? What's all the noise?" They were all talking at once when Mother came in. "Good gracious," she said above all the racket. "Now what?" Everyone stopped talking, even Mrs. Howard. "Will someone please tell me what is going on?" asked Mother, not sounding at all like her usual serene or calm self. Everyone looked at Kit. Poor Kit. Kit knew that Mother disliked messes, So she tried to explain how this one was just an accident. I was coming in here to show Sterling my picture of Ernie Lombardi, she said, and I didn't know that Mrs. Howard was right behind the door. I was in a hurry and I... Mother held up a hand to stop Kit. Don't tell me, she said. I can imagine the rest. She shook her head. How many times have I told you to slow down and watch where you're going, Kit? I'm sorry, said Kit. Mother stooped down to pick up the broken cup. Just look what you've done, she said. Kit was shocked. It wasn't like Mother to scold her like this. But it wasn't my fault, she protested. It was an accident. It was nobody's fault. Nobody's fault, repeated Mother. And yet look at the mess we are in. She looked up at Kit. Please go now, she said. I'll help Mrs. Howard clean up. And Kit, dear, please don't barge in here bothering Sterling and making messes any more. But I didn't, Kit began. That's enough, Kit, said Mother. Go now. Kit gave up. She turned on her heel and stomped back to her room. Mother seemed to think that the mess was all her fault. But it wasn't. She didn't mean to knock into Mrs. Howard. Stupid old Sterling was more to blame for the mess than Kit was. If he weren't sick, his mother wouldn't have been bringing him hot tea in the middle of the afternoon in the first place. Kit flung herself down at the desk and looked at the wrinkled newspaper article in her hand. What did it matter that her photo of Ernie Lombardi holding 7 baseballs was all crumpled up? She couldn't put it up on her new pink walls, and she sure wasn't going to show it to Sterling. She wasn't going to try to be nice to old snivel-nosed Sterling ever again. Look at the trouble it caused her. Nothing made Kit more angry than being unjustly accused. She didn't mind a good, fair fight, but to be blamed for something that was not her fault, that she could not stand. In books, when people were accused of crimes they didn't commit, someone like Nancy Drew or Dick Tracy always came around and proved that they were innocent. Kit could see that in her case, she was going to have to speak for herself. She knew just how to do it, too. She'd write a special newspaper for Dad. Then at least one person would know her side of the story. Kit rolled a piece of paper into the typewriter. In capital letters, she typed her headline. It's not fair. And that's the end of chapter 2. Poor Kit. She was trying to be nice to Sterling and get to know him a little bit, and yet things didn't really go very well for her, did they? So the picture that she was talking about of Ernie Lombardi, I found a picture of on the internet. See, today we're so lucky to be able to look up things like that quickly at any time we want, but she only had one copy from a newspaper and there was probably no way for her to get another copy of it. So that's why she was so upset when it was destroyed. So Ernie Lombardi was a big man and he had giant hands. And so this is the picture of him holding 7 baseballs in one hand. So he was a catcher for the Cincinnati Reds, as they mentioned. And you can see from the picture, too, he has a quite big nose. And a kind of a nickname or slang term for nose is schnoz. And so that was his nickname. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame because he was one of the best catchers ever, one of the best players on the Cincinnati Reds. I have a picture of his baseball card. Not only did he have huge hands, he had a really powerful arm. So as catcher, he was able to throw the ball where it needed to go very powerfully. And he was also a really good batter. But he was slow. It said a lot of times he got criticized for being slow. So he was only able to run around the bases very far if he had hit the ball quite a ways. So he is both Sterling and Kit's hero right now. So maybe they'll be able to make up in the future and talk some more about Ernie Lombardi. At the very end of the chapter, Kit talked about, she mentioned Nancy Drew and Dick Tracy. She mentioned them coming around and proving when someone was innocent. Well, Nancy Drew books have been around for a very long time, since the 1930s. So at the time that Kit was 10 years old, time that this story is taking place, these books were just starting to be written. Nancy Drew is a girl detective, and there are many, many stories of hers. This one is called The Secret of the Old Clock. This is just a picture of it. I don't actually have the book, although American Girl does make several books, Nancy Drew stories in this size. So I'd love to have one of those someday. But this book is the first Nancy Drew book I ever read back when I was a kid, The Secret of the Old Clock. So the Nancy Drew stories have been kind of remade into some chapter books. I remember when I was teaching 4th grade, there were some easy chapter books that were the Nancy Drew crew, I believe. There's been movies and TV shows made out of Nancy Drew, so she's been around for a really long time. I think it's interesting when some of the stories like Beauty and the Beast that have been around for hundreds of years are still popular today. And then the other person that she talked about was Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy was a comic strip character. And so his stories were published in the newspaper in the funnies that we mentioned before. So there would be comic strips of him solving crimes. And his comic strips started to be written in 1931, so right around Kit's time as well. And his stories have been around today. They put some of the comic strips into books. They've made movies about it. Not too long ago, they made a movie about it. So once again, another story that's been around for a really long time. So that's where we'll end today. Kit's feeling unfairly accused. She's frustrated by her new house guest, and she's going to tell her dad all about it so that maybe he will be on her side. I will be back soon to read chapter 3 so we can find out what happens with Kit and the mess. Have a wonderful day.